My name is Samuel Reynolds, and I will be having a webinar on June 14th from 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. on discovering your part in your generation's mission using Uranus. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what I mean by this activation point using Uranus and what it has to do with your generation's mission. Starting with a quote from Frantz Fanon: "Each generation, out of relative obscurity, must discover its mission, fulfill or betray it." And that's something I read when I was in graduate school, and it stuck with me because, one, I wanted to know when I was in my 20s, when I was in graduate school, what's my generation's mission? And how does one discover it? And how can that be significant? And that's what I discovered through astrology. And one of the ways I discovered it was through learning about the Uranus cycle. People have asked me, if Uranus has gone into Taurus, why is this the activation point for the Uranus and Sagittarius generation? So I want to explain that briefly, at least to give you a clue into what I'll be covering in my webinar on June 14th. First, we need to go back. What do I mean by Uranus? Well, Uranus might be better called Prometheus. So that's why I'm calling him the fire bringer. Even though we're talking about Uranus, the sky god, the Greek sky god, who was dethroned by his son, Kronos, also known as Saturn. That's in terms of the myth. I think when we talk about Uranus, the better mythology relates to how we understand Prometheus, and he was the Titan, also similar to Kronos, who actually stole fire from the gods after he had made humankind, and basically the gods had left humankind defenseless and as if they wanted to crush them, and in fact they did. So Prometheus stole fire in order to give to humanity for our benefit and what became the basis for our civilization. So every 83, 84 years, Uranus makes this cycle through the zodiac. So Uranus first went into Taurus about 83, 84 years ago. Uranus, by virtue of the significations that we've attributed to the planet from some aspects of research and then some aspects that are intuitive, deals with how we experience surprises, disruptions, eruptions, revolutions, all the things that go along with some measure of the mythology for Prometheus. One other way you might think about Uranus is that he reflects the cutting edge of culture and individuality, that divine spark or genius, we might say, the reflection of yourself that makes you unique, that makes you yourself. Now, again, that might be confusing because I'm talking about an individual aspect of it, but in the broader sense of it, we're talking about how that might affect, because of the nature of Uranus, taking 7 years to go through a sign and then taking 83 to 84 years to go through the zodiac. We're talking about how that might affect particular quote unquote generations. And again, I just want to make a caveat. By generations, I am talking about both the traditional and non-traditional sense. So for instance, what I'll talk about when I get to Uranus, I might as well mention it now, is that when we're talking about the cycles of Uranus, even though it takes Uranus 7 years to go through a particular sign, by activation, one thing you'll see as I come to some subsequent slides is that the oldest among a generation, let's say those were born with Uranus in Sagittarius, will be about 35 now. But those who are on the latter end, when Uranus was just venturing out of Sag, are closer to maybe 28 and a half, 29. Many of them are 30. So there's a 7-year gap between them. So there's an activation point. What's the secret of that activation point? It's something that we in astrology call the quincunx. So the quincunx literally means that planets have a 150-degree relationship to each other, meaning that you could have something at 0 degrees Aries and something at 0 degrees Virgo, and they would have a relationship of activation as I'm describing here. What we might also call either a gibbous phase, as I'm mentioning here, related to that, or more specifically, the quincunx, 150 degrees. That's the astrology behind it, or I should say the geometry behind it. But what does it mean? Well, I associate the quincunx with a few things. I think it's preparatory, like being backstage, like if you're preparing for a show, you're about to go on stage. It's that moment where you're not on stage, but readying yourself to be on stage. As I quote Hamlet above, the readiness is all. And by the readiness, I'm also talking about how that might reflect, in terms of another kind of analogy, where we're talking about like rehearsals or any other kinds of maintenance that you go through in order to ready for the full-on demonstration of something. Like you put your clothes on before you go outside, ideally, and greet your public. The other way in which we might describe the quincunx is the apprenticeship, being ready along a particular aspect of trade. We might also say that the quincunx reflects a longing that might even feel palpable, but that's not completely relevant to our conversation dealing with this activation by generation. So what you might not know or realize, and I'm going to go more into depth in the webinar, is that we start from Uranus and Taurus, and the quincunx relationship is actually between Sagittarius and Taurus. Now, even though that's kind of going from above the horizon, it's still reflective, because if you go from Uranus in Sag, right, and a direct opposite point would be Uranus in Gemini, the sign just before that is Uranus in Taurus. So I am starting from Uranus in Sag, just to give you the idea. So why the gibbous phase? I mean, that's a natural question. The Uranus opposition usually precipitates a personal crisis to confront or experience. So that would be when Uranus is in Gemini for the Uranus and Sagittarius crew. But the quincunx or gibbous phase is an initiation, an activation, a chance to show the world what's embedded within you without the full pressure just to kind of manifest all of it yet. So this is kind of going toward that preparatory stage, that point where you're seeing it, aware of it, but not quite ready at the same stage of being able to fully express it. So now the Uranus in Taurus is a full-on full moon phase, we might say, or 180 degrees for those with Uranus in Scorpio. So the pressure is more on. And I am going to talk about what each of this, for each of the generations, all the way from Uranus in Cancer to Uranus in Capricorn, what this moment, meaning Uranus and Taurus, signifies for them. So from looking at Uranus's entry into each sign, we can get a sense of the mission. So what I'll be breaking down in my webinar is what's the mission, at least by what we can see by rulership, the activation point for each of these. So for instance, the Uranus in Cancer was more so activated by the Uranus in Sagittarius generation. So when Uranus went into Sagittarius in the 80s, it was an activation for those with Uranus in Cancer. What did that mean? So we can get an update. So for each of the generations, for Uranus in Cancer, what did it mean for Uranus to go into Aries and now into Taurus? Then what does it mean for the Uranus in Leo generation, and so forth? But of course, because this is an activation point for the Uranus in Sagittarius, I am going to talk more about that. So that's in a nutshell what I plan to cover, and to get more also into how you might be able to identify or look at some markers in your chart to get a personal sense of how you're dealing with your mission. So for example, I'm the Uranus in Virgo generation activated by the Uranus in Aquarius. So when Uranus went into Aquarius, that was an activation point for us. So my generation, we dealt more with the very idea of how to make improvements in the workplace. Virgoan ideas, how to deal with the preparatory stages of how we deal with labor. Uranus in Aquarius brought us the World Wide Web. So our generation didn't invent the World Wide Web or the internet, but we did a lot of work and development related to that. So what's interesting personally for me, because I have what we call an angular Uranus, a very prominent Uranus in my chart as an example, is I became a tech trainer. So I was a tech trainer for pretty much from 1998 all the way until I became a full-time astrologer, more so in 2012. So just to give you an idea of knowing some measure of that mission dealing with technology and the like, that has figured in my life. And then you can see by looking at whether it's the angular position of Uranus in your chart or how it connects to particular planets, you can get a sense of how you're working with your generation's mission. Again, I'm doing the webinar on Thursday, June 14th, 6 o'clock to 7:30 Eastern Daylight Savings Time. You can go to my.vasita.com/SF Reynolds to sign up, and then you can see here how you can follow through in terms of where to go, my events. And one thing I did not mention that I will now mention is that it will be recorded. So if you can't make it, even though you've paid for it, you still will get the recording, and it will also come just like this with an actual video for you to check out. So thank you, and I look forward to seeing you on June 14th.